Hello, and welcome to today's Ask the Experts webinar, Unreal, Online Misinformation, Deepfakes, and Youth. I'm Kris Perry, Executive Director of Children and Screens Institute of Digital Media and Child Development. The ability to discern real information from fake information is more important than ever. However, spotting deepfakes and misinformation is a challenge even for adults. In today's webinar, a panel of experts will discuss how children understand reality and truth, how their developing cognitive skills play a role, and how parents, caregivers, and educators can help them think critically to navigate misinformation and deep fakes. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's moderator, Diana Graber. Diana is the author of Raising Humans in a Digital World, Helping Kids Build a Healthy Relationship with Technology. She is the founder of two organizations devoted to digital literacy, CyberWise and CyberCivics. Diana developed and teaches a popular middle school digital literacy program currently being taught in schools across the United States and internationally. She has appeared on and has been interviewed by The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and more. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you, Kris, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here today to talk about a subject that I think is really, really important. Before I introduce the wonderful panelists, I wanted to share a personal reflection on how important this topic is to me. I was thinking back to 2011 or so when I first started working with kids on digital literacy. And at that time, we were really focused on digital citizenship, which is a safe and responsible use of tools. We thought that was great, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg of what kids need to learn, which became immensely clear to me as I worked with these kids. At that time, some eighth graders were presenting some research projects that they had worked on for quite a while. And so I was listening, and one of the girls, her topic was on human trafficking. And in the audience, I heard her repeat what I knew to be a conspiracy theory. And later I learned that she had done her research primarily on YouTube, because she figured if it was on YouTube, it must be true. So that really underscored to me that, just learning to use your tools safely is not enough. Kids need to learn how to do information research, how to assess what's true and not true. That was a long time ago, 2011. Today, kids are dealing with AI and all these new technologies. So this topic is super, super important. All right, so I'm going to set the stage today by talking definitions. So let me share my screen. All right, so just a few definitions here. We know that misinformation is false or misleading information not generally created or shared with the intention of causing harm. Disinformation is information that has been deliberately falsified. It has been created to mislead, harm, or manipulate a person, social group, organization, or country. An example here from the hurricane, Milton. Hurricanes often seem to give us a lot of fodder for both misinformation and disinformation, which leads us to the deepfake. This is an image or video that has been altered to misrepresent someone as doing or saying something that was not actually said or done. Here's a deepfake that was shared widely during our most recent hurricane. Maybe you saw it. We know that this is becoming more and more of a problem because between 2019 and 2023, the number of deepfakes online increased by 552%, with research indicating it's going to increase even more. In this survey, 50% of participants rated deepfake content as probably real or definitely real, even after being informed that there was a chance they'd seen a deepfake. Oh, here's an example of one.
For example, what you're watching right now. I'm actually not Jake. I'm a deepfake Jake, a deep Jake, if you will, created by comedian Danny Polishuk, who has only been using AI for 2 weeks. The fact that I seem so real suggests that real mischief and serious damage could be done with this technology were it to be so utilized in the US, as it has been for bad purposes abroad.
So yeah, pretty good, right? Okay, so we know that young people are getting their information primarily from social media, as this chart will show you. 45% people aged between 15 and 24 receive their information from social media. That study was done a few years ago. Here's a more recent study just put out by Pew Internet. 4 in 10 young adults in the US now regularly get their news on TikTok. Pretty crazy, right? As I always tell students, remember TikTok is very young users. It's user-generated content. Generally, those users aren't experts in anything yet, so beware of what you find out on TikTok, right? Okay, so where else are they going for information? Well, number one, by far and away, is YouTube still. 95% of teens use YouTube. Some say they use it almost daily. And then kind of significantly behind that are the big three: TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. Again, these are all user-generated networks. Okay, so a NewsGuard study analysis finds that in their first 35 minutes on TikTok, 88.8% of participants are shown misinformation thanks to their awesome algorithm. YouTube, during COVID, it was estimated that a quarter of the videos related to COVID contain misinformation. This platform can amplify misleading content through its recommendation algorithm. This can lead to the rapid spread of conspiracy theories and misinformation. I'm going to show you an example. So I pretended to be a student doing a research paper on the moon landing. So the first video I got, pretty legitimate video, but very suddenly I fell into the YouTube rabbit hole. These are the recommendations that YouTube gave me. Did Stanley Kubrick fake the moon landings? I don't believe the moon landing happened. The moon landing conspiracy. So you can see what happens to kids, unwittingly, they start getting these recommendations from YouTube. And we know this to be true. This is research from the News Literacy in America project. 80% of teens see conspiracy theories on social media, including the idea that aliens live among us. Keep that in mind for a moment. About half reported seeing them at least once a week. Of the teens who reported seeing conspiracy theories, 81% said they believed at least one. So what do we do? So I really think, the best weapon we have against this, especially with Gen AI and all this stuff coming at us, is to equip kids with education. And media literacy is one way to do it. This is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. But this is also from the News Literacy in America report. 94% of teens say that schools should be required to teach media literacy, yet only 39% report having had any media literacy instruction at all in at least one class in the last school year. So that is just where we are on this. We've got to equip kids with these skills. So we actually went full on after my little experience in 2011. We added a whole year of information literacy, a whole year of media literacy, all these lessons on algorithms and AI and filter bubbles and the things that kids really need to know about. And I laughed when I read that research about aliens among us because we actually started offering lessons for elementary school kids on the same topics. I'll just play a moment of this for you.
Whoa! It says right here that aliens just landed. I can't believe this. Turns out I really couldn't believe it because it wasn't true. Did you know that not everything you see online is true?
So I'm going to stop it there because we have a lot of great people to get to today. I believe that video will be offered in the resources if you want to watch the whole thing later. So, okay, Dr. Rakoen Maertens, hopefully I said that correctly, is the J.C. Matthews Research Fellow in Psychology at New College. He completed his BSc and MSc in experimental psychology at the University of Ghent. He then pursued his PhD in psychology at the University of Cambridge in Professor Sander van der Linden's lab, focusing on how to apply psychological science to fight fake news and misinformation, for which he received the CSAR Award for Applied Research. He co-founded the Cambridge University Behavioral Insights Team and the Oxford Behavioral Insights Group, and he currently serves as the representative to the United Nations of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Thank you so much, and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, so I am going to give a quick introduction into the cognitive science of misinformation susceptibility. So I am a psychologist. I am also do behavioral science. And really, 8 minutes is not enough to give you a good introduction, but I will just flag some concepts so that you can think in the psychologist's toolkit on this issue. Right, so let's start with a concrete example. Imagine that you go to the shops and you want to buy some groceries and you're there with your children and someone in your family has this idea, let's buy apples, and you know apples are healthy, good for the winter. Now that everyone is getting ill, maybe get your apples. But maybe on TikTok or anywhere, you've seen a video about that apples are actually full of dangerous insects hidden in it and you might get infected. Also on there may be AI generated photos and so on. And you might have been repeatedly exposed to this. You might not believe it. You might say, this is nonsense. But the repeated exposure might settle this in your mind. And then next time when you're in the shops, you have these two ideas. You have these healthy apples, but maybe that AI generated image may also come up to your mind. And what often happens then, you might change your behavior while not changing your belief. You might still not believe the misinformation, but because you have this image of this badly looking apple, you might still skip it. And this is an example of the illusory truth effect, where you repeatedly get exposed to something and you might start believing it, or even if you don't believe it, you might still act on it, even if you're not fully on board. And then undoing the damage is another one. Imagine that your kid believes this, that apples are dangerous, and then you tell them, no, it's not true. It might still be very hard to undo the damage. There might be this link settled in the brain. Once the damage is done, it's hard often to undo it. As a behavioral scientist, I was also interested in this link between what you believe and so your actual behavior. This headline is for me a very good example of how that link exists. Here, people put cell phone towers on fire because they believed in a COVID conspiracy theory. So one wouldn't put a cell phone tower on fire if it wasn't for a good reason, I hope. Okay, so in general, psychologists, again, very simplified, but think of the brain as that we work with two systems. We have a first system that is what we use most of the time. We make intuitive decisions all the time, the way we walk, how we behave ourselves in most situations. We don't really think about this in an analytical way. We just do it. It's an unconscious, efficient system, and we use it most of the time. System 2 is a slower, rational system that analytically looks at content, but it requires energy. It's not easy to do, to use that system. You need to really sit down and think. And of course, system 2 is something you have to nurture and develop, and education is important for that. But even if we are educated, we might often rely on system 1, and especially children, they are even more system 1 based because the system 2 is not so strong yet. Now, if we look at information, we have to evaluate all these dimensions: accuracy, manipulativeness, authenticity. Is this a high quality source? What is the quality of this data? There's a lot of things going on, and at the same time, you have information overload. We see that partially due to algorithms, partially due to human nature, we spend more time on negative content. We don't like negative content, but we spread emotional and moral content more often, and we engage more. So that boosts the algorithm. And this is largely driven by system 1 thinking. Now, there are all kind of interventions, of course, to activate your rational thinking systems. For example, accuracy nudges were first used on Twitter, where when anyone tries to share a potential misinformation message, Twitter might have asked you, X still has some of these left, might ask you, do you really want to share this? Do you really want to like this? And that stop, pause moment could help you activate system 2, but it's difficult and the long-term effectiveness is disputed. Another big factor against system 1 based is identity. People want to belong to groups, right? And a lot of people share misinformation or create misinformation even if they don't believe it necessarily. They just do it often because they want to belong to a group. So whether it's Democrats or Republicans, or in high school you want to belong to this group of people that are the cool kids on school, maybe what you have to do is share information that aligns with that group's vision, right? Even if you don't believe it. And this is a huge factor in the fight against misinformation. You might teach them rational thinking skills, but if you want to belong to a group, it might even be beneficial for yourself to spread misinformation. So how do you balance these priorities? An interesting variable that I want to mention quickly, in my research, I found that surprisingly, one of the best predictors of resilience to misinformation is not only the rational thinking skills, but also being open-minded. And this actively open-minded thinking, this means two things: being open to new ideas that are not in line with your own vision or not in line with your own group, and being humble, intellectual humility, and being able to acknowledge that you might not be accurate. This is a good skill to have, actually, and could help you to get stuck in a really robust conspiracy. Now, if we I work a lot on interventions to counter misinformation. You might think of this yourself. Whether you're a kid or an adult, you can use many of the tools that we've developed as psychologists. But just to give you a quick idea, debunking is really difficult, right? Because of this continued influence, but also you might by accident repeat the myth, or someone might try to debunk it that you don't like. Then this clash of visions about the world might make you distrust the fact checker, and so on. Luckily, there are some tools. So this is the first step. Have a look at the debunking handbook. It gives some really good tips on how to do debunking properly. You could also do it during exposure to misinformation, like with the nudges that I mentioned. Or you could indeed educate, and one of those methods is inoculation theory. No time to explain, but in a nutshell, the idea is that you can teach people how to recognize elements of misleading language or of false language or potentially bad data, and you can do that at any age. And then you can teach them to recognize that and categorize it proactively as potentially fake before someone starts believing it. And you can do this in text-based form, gamified, video-based, and so on. And the gamified form is especially fun to do in classrooms, right? Or with your kids at home and so on. So really good resource for educators. There's an educator sheet as well. And there's some of these interventions have a version specifically for kids. So the bad news game, for example, a 15-minute fun game to play, has a bad news junior version. That's just an example. And typically we teach people about different techniques of manipulating people online so that you don't fall for it. Many different languages. Okay, there are many different types of similar interventions: cranky uncle, spot the troll, and so on, and videos as well. So these videos are also fun to watch and discuss. So if you want to eat any of these resources afterwards, do let me know. Okay, a final fun thing is I developed a test, the misinformation susceptibility test, and you can try the test online. If you go to this link in a classroom, I would now have a QR code and we would have a moment to discuss the results, but feel free to do it and maybe post your result in the chat. It's a 2-minute test and you basically have to categorize real fake headlines, and then you get a score on each dimension of your susceptibility and you can compare it with others. And it's also fun to do in school, of course. I'm going to skip because I'm out of time. But in general, the test shows that older people are surprisingly better at this test. So there's this big debate going on. Are younger people or older people more susceptible? It seems to be younger, at least according to this test. The final thing has not been said. Probably different dimensions of susceptibility. But what we do see is that the lowest scoring on the test use Snapchat, TikTok, and Instagram as their primary sources for news. So from the introductory slides we just had, there seems to be a big problem. Okay, for more information, read the book Foolproof. I can recommend it. It gives you a full psychological introduction into the topic. And remember, there are, from a psychological perspective, the big factors are the social identity, the reasoning skills, the system 2 thinking, and the open-mindedness. And really, the paid inoculation games encourage this norm of intellectual humility and also focus on bridging visions rather than just attacking opponents. Okay, right. Any questions? Oh no, there was a structure for this, right?
Well, I have a lot of questions. But I really love that presentation and got an open-mindedness thing. I'd never really considered that before. So that kind of leads into one of the questions I wanted to ask you regarding youth. In your view, like what specific skills do you think kids need most to prepare them to kind of deal with all this stuff? Like what would you suggest they would zone in on, maybe at the elementary level or the middle school level?
Well, I'm going to say something. So, I mean, there are many things you could expect me to say, like certain types of media literacy skills and so on. But I actually will say something completely different. I will say, actually, teach people to get along with people that you don't get along with. So, if you manage to listen to other people's vision, even if you completely disagree with them, and accept them in your in-group, you will be more likely to come towards a common ground that is more closer to the truth on average than if you get polarized. So I feel a lot of training on argumentation and logic is about, okay, finding where is the flaw and attacking it, right? And that's something I got in my high school. I got a rational thinking lesson. But I think the mistake there was this can lead to more polarization. And if you have a polarized society, you will have less and less mutual understanding and you will go further in your silos. So my thing would be really actually play the games and do the rational thinking training, but also don't forget to focus on bridging the divides. And even if you don't agree with someone, even if someone is spreading misinformation, allow them in your friend group, whether they're kids or adults, the same mechanism applies.
Oh, that's a great tip. It really reminds us that so much of this are social emotional skills, how we think about other people, having empathy and understanding and all that. So thank you for that reminder. Great presentation. All right. So now we've got Dr. Andrew Shtulman. He is a professor of psychology at Occidental College, where he directs the Thinking Lab. Dr. Shtulman, I hope I'm saying that correctly, is a cognitive developmental psychologist who studies the development of intuition, imagination, and reflection. He earned a BA in psychology from Princeton and a PhD in psychology from Harvard, and is the author of Science Blind: Why Our Intuitive Theories About the World Are So Often Wrong, and Learning to Imagine: The Science of Discovering New Possibilities. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Today I'm going to talk about children's susceptibility to online misinformation. And by children, I mean elementary school age children. All right. Here's a story that circulated far and wide on the internet several years ago. California newborn becomes first baby to be named an emoji. Her name is Hard Eyes, Hard Eyes, Hard Eyes. From prettycoolsite.com. This story is not true, but it was shared thousands of times and liked tens of thousands of times. And chances are some of the people who liked and shared the story were children. So these days, children are on the internet at increasingly earlier ages. 89% of elementary schoolers have regular access to the internet. But while they're on the internet, they don't necessarily understand what it's about. So most children think that information on the internet is usually accurate and can be trusted without further scrutiny. Other research has found that when children are searching for information on a specific topic, they're indifferent to the websites they come across, whether they contain inaccuracies or exaggerations. Children are generally poor at identifying satirical web content, like a web page devoted to the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. Most of the children who went to this site had no idea it was a joke. And then children are also poor at discriminating news from the other things that might appear on a news page, such as advertisements and user comments. So children do seem to be more susceptible to online misinformation than adults. And why is that? One possibility is that children are especially prone to believe content. They just believe everything. Another possibility is that children are especially prone to believe sources of information. They believe everyone. But decades of developmental research suggests that neither of these possibilities are correct. So when it comes to evaluating content, children definitely do not believe that anything is possible. From as early as you can ask children about physical possibility, they deny that things that violate physical laws could happen in the real world. In fact, young children are actually too skeptical when it comes to assessing possibility. They not only deny the possibility of genuinely impossible things, but also things that are merely improbable. So if you read a story to a child, a story that includes impossible events like eating lightning for dinner, they'll claim that couldn't happen in the real world, it's impossible. But if the story also contains just unusual things that don't violate physical laws, like someone finding an alligator under their bed, they also claim that that is impossible. So children know that fantastical events cannot happen in the real world. What they need to learn is that some unexpected events can. When it comes to evaluating sources, children are quite adept at tracking the reliability of informants or people in their environment who are sharing information with them. As early as 2, children are attending to an informant's accuracy, knowledge, competence, and confidence when deciding whether to trust them. And this has been shown in a selective trust paradigm, where children are introduced to 2 informants and given some information about their reliability. For instance, the informants might see a common object and are asked to label it, and one informant provides the correct label and another provides an incorrect label. And you do this for several trials, and then the informants see a novel object and they also label it, say it's a blicket or it's a dax. And then if you ask the children what they think the novel object is, they'll side with the informant that proved accurate in the past trials. So children are neither credulous nor gullible, not even at very early ages, but the internet is a special place. The internet thwarts children's natural defenses against misinformation that they might use in real world contexts. So online, content is framed as verified facts, not hypothetical possibilities they can think about and reject. Online sources of information are often hidden or even fabricated, and children do not have access to the past records of accuracy and reliability for those sources. So, how can we help children become better consumers of information online? In my lab, we've been asking children between the ages of 4 and 12 to judge the veracity of real and fake news stories that were found on the fact checking website Snopes.com. We've also been attempting to improve their judgments with training. So, here's one of the true stories we've been presenting to children. A walrus named Freya is sinking boats and causing mayhem in Norway from HuffPost.com. Here's one of the fake stories. Disney files patent for roller coaster that jumps track from mousecrapnews.com. And in addition to asking them to judge the veracity of these stories, we've also been encouraging them to think more deeply about the content of news stories. In particular, to ask themselves, does this story make sense given what I know about the topic? And does this story make sense given what I know about the world in general? For other children, we've been encouraging them to think more deeply about the sources of the story, asking themselves, does the story come from a professional news organization? And if I don't know or I can't tell, is it reported neutrally and objectively? We haven't found that the very many difference between the trainings. So when it comes to judging fake news, children are actually pretty good at realizing that fake news is false. 67% of the time, even before training, they judge fake news as false. And that number increases to 76% after training. But the catch is that they're also judging real news as false. So only 35% of the time do children judge the real news as true before the training, and that number drops to 24% after the training. So our trainings are making children more skeptical, but not more accurate. So their overall accuracy across the two types of news is 51% prior to training, and it stays around that number after training. So you might wonder, is this a problem? Is it a problem that children are erring on the side of rejecting real news rather than accepting fake news? We think it is because few children are actually differentiating the two types of news, which implies that their judgments are rather shallow. Their gut reactions to some superficial detail in the story. Among the 4 and 5-year-olds, we see that only 20% are differentiating the two types of news in the correct direction. Among 6 and 7-year-olds, it's only 28%. Among 8 to 9-year-olds, it's 35%. Among 10 to 12-year-olds, there's a jump up to 61%, but across the entire set of stories, the differentiation is quite weak. So if children are making shallow judgments, this is a problem because these judgments are probably easily overridden in real-world contexts by social cues, like how often the story is liked, how often it's shared, whether it's been shared by a trusted informant like a family member or a friend. So then what's missing? What do children need to know to differentiate real news from fake news? We've been implementing these exact same studies with adults, and the results have been providing some clues. So we find that the content training does not help adults differentiate fake news from real news, just like it doesn't help children. It just makes adults more skeptical of all news. But source training is helpful for adults. So when we give adults source training, first of all, before any training, 81% of the time, they judged our fake stories as false. And then after training, that jumps up to 90%. For real news, 73% of the time, they judged our real news stories as true prior to training. And that also increases up to 79% after training. So overall accuracy for adults before training, given our particular story set, is 77%. But by reminding them that they should be paying attention to the sources, their accuracy increases to 85%. So I think that's really the critical difference between children and adults. I mean, adults aren't great consumers of news online, but they do have a knowledge base of sources that they can draw on to decide, what's reliable and what's not. And children do not have that same knowledge base. So, from my perspective, I think media literacy education should be focusing on sources, not content, because content does not provide sufficient leverage for differentiating fake news from real news. Unexpectedness might be the primary sign that a fake news story is false, but it's often also the reason why real news is in the news at all, what makes it newsworthy. So some open questions we're pursuing now is what information about sources might be most helpful to children. Perhaps it's general information about journalistic practices and how to report stories, write stories, vet stories. but maybe it's something more specific about the news outlets themselves, which ones are reliable and which ones are not. All right, so I will end there and open the floor to questions.
That was great. Thank you so much. I think that getting that focus on sources is such great such a great recommendation because it's so simple. Even a small young child, you could say, okay, well, who is the author of this? Who is this person? Is it a random person? Is it an expert? So I think that source bit is so helpful. But there's another question here I wanted to ask you. At what age do children begin to understand the difference between reality and digital manipulation?
Right. Young children's perceptual abilities are nearly as good as an adult. So if the digitally manipulated content gives any cues perceptually, kids can pick up on those just as well as an adult can. If it's a video where the motion is jerky or the hands are wrong in the video, kids will see that just like adults will. But if it's perceptually convincing to an adult, it's going to be perceptually convincing to a child. And so I think then you would see differences in acceptance because adults might start questioning, where did this come from? Why am I seeing it? What are the intentions behind the picture, the video, whatever it might be? Whereas children are less likely to do that.
Mm.
And so it's in the probably the middle school years where you see maybe the biggest transition, but from the young children who are not making much of a differentiation at all between real and fake news, and in the adolescence that's emerging.
The skepticism's coming in.
Well, right. I mean, they're always skeptical, but the skepticism is shallow. So I think that's important to remember that children are not just open-minded, accepting everything. They're actually skeptical about everything, but it's a shallow skepticism that can be easily knocked down in the face of a trusted authority or some kind of social cue that you should believe this information.
Right. Great. Well, great information. Thank you. All right. So we're going to move on now to our next presenter. Next up, we have Imran Ahmed. Am I saying that correctly? Hopefully, give me the nod. Okay, thank you. He is the founder and CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate US UK. He is an authority on social and psychological malignancies on social media, such as identity-based hate, extremism, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. He regularly appears in the media and in documentaries as an expert in how bad actors use digital spaces to harm others and benefit themselves, as well as how and why bad platforms allow them to do so. Imran also advises politicians around the world on policy and legislation. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for the kind introduction. My name is Imran Ahmed. I'm CEO and I'm founder of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. What the center does is try to understand the ways in which social media and new tools like AI can actually cause real-world harm. And AI is a growing area of our focus. We're trying to monitor the risk landscape by testing the tools, testing their capabilities, testing their guardrails, and also understanding the ways in which they are spread, that the content that they produce is being spread on social media, which is, of course, the most powerful tool invented in history for the fast, almost cost-free distribution of information, whether that information is right or not. One of the things that unifies both these types of platforms, social media and AI, is that it's become really clear over time that they aren't designed with safety in mind. They aren't actually designed with the intent to create good information, to create, they're not about being correct or accurate or teaching us about reality. They're entertainment platforms. That's how they make their money. You use them lots and you watch ads, and that's how they have made themselves incredibly, immensely, unbelievably wealthy. And what we've realized over time as well, I've been doing this work for 8 years now, that platforms know they are harming people. They know they're harming kids. Their internal studies, as brought forwards by whistleblowers, show that they know what they are up to. They know the harm that they can cause. And they have a model when they deal with criticism of denying, delaying, and deflecting.
In some instances, even more than that. Let me speak briefly about disinformation and misinformation. These are terms that you've heard being used today, and they can be a little bit confusing. I don't like terms like that. I find them that they're in some respects they're almost exclusionary because they sound scientific, but misinformation is just being wrong, and disinformation is lying. The intent is there, and being wrong, folks are wrong all the time. I'm wrong. I mean, that's my wife. But lying is a sinful thing to do. And I think when we're dealing with AI, it's really interesting as a thought experiment to think to yourself, to what extent is AI, when it generates wrong information, for example, a platform, and you ask it a question, it's badly made, it's got bad inputs, and so it gives you nonsense. That's misinformation. But then AI tools can be used by people who seek to mislead people, to lie to them, to mislead them with intent. And that's disinformation. Let me speak about the core problem for a moment of generative AI models. So the core problem with AI, and the reason why it's becoming such a sort of a cultural phenomenon in our understanding of the risk, is because, like social media, this is about the creation of tools that operate for zero cost. And we've talked about that being called friction before, a lack of friction. So social media's great innovation is that it allows the distribution of a message to each additional person and each additional message for zero cost to the sender. And that's unique in history. We've never had a way of sending 1 billion people 1 billion messages without any cost to the sender themselves, apart from the time and effort it takes to produce it. Along comes generative AI, and that reduces the cost of production to zero. So you've got a system in which you can produce stuff and distribute it for zero cost to the originator. And that's really creating a perpetual BS machine. And that's problematic. It's flooding the information ecosystem with nonsense that's really hard sometimes to discern from reality. We've talked earlier about being humble about this sort of stuff. There's a thing I do whenever I'm doing presentations like this in a room of real people. Well, I'm sure you're all real, but you know what I mean. And I asked the question, now what vegetable gives you better night vision? And everyone knows I'm up to something. And they go, oh, I know the answer, but I'm not going to say it because he's up to something and I am up to something. And then eventually someone brave pipes up and goes, carrots. And I tell them that that was actually World War II disinformation produced by the British Secret Intelligence Service to hide the fact that we'd developed plane-mounted radar, and that's why we were shooting down German bombers at night. So our Secret Intelligence Service wanted to hide our new technology and put in the newspapers that we were feeding our pilots carrots because we'd discovered that if you give them lots of carrots, they get better night vision. And 80 years later, after the war, we still all believe it, don't we? So disinformation is all around us, but we've never had this asymmetry in which there can be so much of it pumped into our information ecosystem. And of course, for a young person, I'm a new father, very new father. I've got an 11.5-week-old daughter at home, and I think really hard about what it is that I want to teach her, because of course, curating the information I give to her, helping her to learn in an effective way, the science of pedagogy is really complex, and it's something we think about really hard as parents. Now imagine immersing your child into a space in which nonsense and truth intermingle seamlessly without any real way of differentiating between the two. Can anyone imagine why that's a real problem for us? And the second problem, of course, is that we call these systems like AI artificially intelligent, when of course quite often the stuff that they put out is nonsensical, is untrue. there's almost a problem with the word intelligence, isn't there? I mean, it's not intelligent if it's spouting nonsense. And I'm going to show you some ways in which it is nonsense. We do tests. We look at the ways in which these models, which are trained on large amounts of unfiltered, often biased and inaccurate data. I mean, there are some social media platforms developing their own AI tools which are based on what people post on social media. That's not a great way to train an intelligent tool, because a lot of what is posted on social media isn't really intelligent now, is it? And especially when AI is then integrated into search engines. So when you search for information, Google is a verb. It's a company, sure, but we Google information, don't we? We Google a question. What's the best diaper for my baby? Google it. But when the first result is an AI-generated answer, and that can actually be based on poor data, that can be really problematic. And we test the platforms to see how they work. We look at things like, we've done studies looking at things like how popular AI tools respond to a question by a child on how they can lose weight. One of them said, chewing and spitting is an effective way to do it. Another one said, camouflaging food in everyday items to hide your uneaten food is a good way to fool your parents and eat fewer calories. One of them, this is honestly true, one of them said, swallow a tapeworm egg and let it grow inside you to lose weight. Artificially intelligent. We looked at things like Grok, which is the AI platform integrated into X. We asked it 60 questions about election disinformation. It didn't reject any of them in terms of generating new disinformation. So it generated everything from images of election ballots being burnt and stolen. It generated hateful images of Jews, Muslims, Black people, and LGBTQ+ people. And we found that bad actors are using tools to create and spread political disinformation as well. There are people out there that are so willing to mislead their fellow citizens and our children that they will use these tools to produce disinformation at scale. So we have a problem, right? We have these systems which we tell people are intelligent. We tell our kids are artificially intelligent. They are often based on poor data sets. They often generate without thinking, like a normal human being would. I mean, if a 12-year-old girl came up to me and said, how can I lose weight? I wouldn't tell her to swallow a tapeworm egg. I don't think anyone would. And yet we tell people, and yet these systems are considered the cutting edge of human endeavor and understanding. So it's in part the way that we present these technologies and the way that they've been built, the commercial models that underpin them. And what's the impact? We did a study a few years ago, last year. Everything just seems, time dilates when you're working hard. We did a study last year asking young people about conspiracy theories. So we asked adults and kids, 1,000 adults, 1,000 kids, and we did it in both the US and the UK, my home country. I live in the US though. About conspiracy theories. And what we found was that the most conspiratorial age cohort, were 14 to 17-year-olds. The first generation raised on short-form video platforms. That's really disturbing. For example, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, over half of young people who used social media for 4+ hours a day believed that Jews were malevolent and had control of our politics and our economy. To a European, those are scary numbers. They lead to bad things, those sorts of numbers. So what do we need? Well, often the discussion around the types of policies we want doesn't really matter if it's AI or social media that we're talking about. This is a two-pronged issue. You've got an industry, and that we need to ask it, how are the tools being developed, tested? How are they managing risk? How do they work to ensure that their tools are not being used to generate harmful content? The social media platforms, we're asking them how they're collaborating to ensure that dissemination of AI-generated content, harmful AI-generated content, is not spread on their platforms, and how they enforce their own rules, right? They've got rules, these platforms. We all sign up to them when we join the platform. We agree that we won't spread disinformation, we won't be hateful to other people. How are they enforcing those rules? And we have a program that we call the STAR framework. That's a framework that I've been advocating around the world to lawmakers for many years now. It says that safety is created by transparency, first of all. Better, not less speech, more speech. Tell us how your platforms work. Give us more insight so we're informed when we then hold you accountable. The A in STAR. We ask you tough questions and we expect real answers. And then if you are causing harm, we should be able to hold you responsible. Look, I've dealt with parents whose kids have died because of self-harm content online that was flooded to them by algorithms, which is really disturbing when you deal with them, especially as a parent. It gets you in the gut. And they can't hold those companies responsible, despite the fact that their kids were flooded with thousands of images that may have induced harm, may have induced them to hurt themselves, to cut themselves or kill themselves, or to become to suffer eating disorders or other psychological trauma. And there's no way of holding them accountable at the moment. So how can we hold them accountable in future? But there's a million other things they could do as well. You know, these platforms aren't designed, as I said earlier, with safety in mind from the outset. So incorporating safety features such as curating and vetting learning materials before the AI analyzes them to remove harmful, misleading, or hateful content, ensuring that subject matter experts are employed and consulted in developing training materials for AI. Look, there's no such thing as a racist algorithm, but there are algorithms that are programmed by people that aren't thinking cleverly about whether or not the outputs may be damaging or discriminatory. If you want to train an AI to act like an expert, it should be trained by an expert of that field. And constraints on the model's output should be put in place to ensure that they stop anything being generated that is harmful or misleading or dangerous. Implement error correction mechanisms to fix issues when they arise. Now, you know, I'm saying all these things and you're thinking, crumbs, well, these are obvious, Imran. And you're right, they are, but they're not being done right now. And that's why CCDH and others, you know, I recognize many of the folks who are speaking today are working so hard on helping to bring to light, bringing transparency, shining sunlight on the way these systems work, so that we get them to realize that most people would be annoyed if they realized that they haven't taken due care with platforms that have such an enormous impact on our society. I mean, there is no real transparency when it comes to these models. There is no transparency on how their safety works. And that really is what we should all be working towards, because these technologies, like it or not, are here. They're here to stay. And what we want to make sure is that they serve humanity in the most positive way possible, because they have such enormous potential. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well said. Well said. So thank you so much. We're a little short on time, but I'm going to ask you a really quick follow-up to that. So many kids today have YouTube channels and TikTok channels. What advice would you give to those parents?
Look, I think it really comes down to each individual child in one respect. And some children are able to discern between the nonsense they're seeing. Some of them have a robustness and resilience. Some of the advice being given earlier today is incredibly useful. But let me tell you a dirty secret of Silicon Valley. I'm actually in Silicon Valley at the moment. Is that most of the people here would never let their kids, when they're young, spend time on those platforms. And that should be an indication itself as to whether or not they think they're safe for your kids and my kids.
Great advice. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, so we're going to move on to our final presenter today, Dr. Joel Breakstone. Welcome. He is the Executive Director of the Digital Inquiry Group, DIG, a new education nonprofit He directed the Stanford History Education Group for 10 years before spinning it out of Stanford to become DIG. He leads its efforts to research, develop, and disseminate free curriculum and assessments. This work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, the Wall Street Journal. He received a PhD from Stanford Graduate School of Education and previously taught high school history in Vermont. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be able to spend some time with you. As Diana noted, our organization, the Digital Inquiry Group, is new, but our work in this area is not. We previously, from nearly 2 decades, were based at Stanford University, focused on, initially, as the name of our organization suggested, creating history curriculum materials, but for the last 10 years, focusing as well on how to support young people to be better consumers of online information. And certainly that is a crucial issue, as all of the presenters so far have identified. Young people are living online lives, and we need to support them in making sense of the overwhelming amount of information that streams across their devices. And that issue is particularly important because sometimes, because young people have grown up with digital devices, there is a tendency to assume that they also know how to make sense of the information that comes across their screens. During the last election cycle, Politico published a piece in which they said, to be sure, Gen Z doesn't need lessons on how to use the internet. They aren't falling for the same fake news stories that may have duped their parents in 2016. And my colleagues and I were pretty struck by that statement because as that came out, we were in the midst of a national study in which we were asking students all across the United States to evaluate real online sources. In total, it was more than 3,000 students, a sample that represents the population of high school students in the United States. And one of the tasks that we asked students to complete was to examine a social media video which claimed to show voter fraud in a previous American election. And when students were asked to complete that task, they had access to a live internet connection. We told students that they could do whatever they wanted to figure out whether or not to trust that source, and encourage them to do what they normally would do. And if students had just opened up a new tab in their internet browser and searched for information about the video, they could have almost immediately found out that the video was entirely false. It was not really showing people stuffing ballots during an election in the United States. There's a Snopes article debunking it. And even more persuasively, there was a BBC article that explained that all of the footage that claimed to show voter fraud in the United States actually depicted voter fraud in Russia. And it came from an investigation that the BBC had done into voting irregularities in Russia. And so it had nothing to do with what the social media post claimed that it did. Now, our digital natives, young people who grew up with digital devices and sometimes people believe are particularly good at using them to find credible information, how many of them were able to identify the Russian source of that video? A grand total of 3, less than 1/10 of 1% identified the Russian source. That kind of result should give pause to anybody who is concerned about the health of our democracy. We want people to be making decisions based on credible and reliable information. And if young people are so easily misled, that should give us all pause. And so the question then is, how can we help students do better? What are more effective strategies for making sense of online information? And to try to answer that question, we set out to identify expertise, and we asked 3 different groups of people to evaluate online sources. And we thought each one of them might be skilled at this. The first were Stanford students, young people living in the heart of Silicon Valley who are online all the time. The second group were history professors, folks who evaluate information for a living. And then the third group were fact checkers, folks from the nation's leading news outlets who are tasked with ensuring the quality of the information that is presented in those outlets. And what we did was to observe people as they evaluated unfamiliar sources, and we recorded their screens and asked them to think out loud as they went through the process. And there were some really striking differences across these groups. The students and the historians tended to initially just stay on a source and read it carefully. One of the tasks focused on an article from the website minimumwage.com. And in general, the historians and the students read it very carefully. And then maybe sometimes did some additional searching after a while. In contrast, the fact checkers almost immediately left the website, to figure out who's behind this source. They found out that it was from the Employment Policies Institute, and then they did some searching about the Employment Policies Institute. And again, within a matter of 30 seconds or a minute, they were able to figure out that the Employment Policies Institute is actually a front group for Washington's D.C. public relations firm that is working on the behalf of the food and beverage industry, folks who have a vested interest in keeping minimum wages low. All of the fact checkers figured out that information. The chart shows how quickly the fact checkers just figured out that minimumwage.com was run by Employment Policies Institute. They did it in less than a minute. Took both the historians in orange and the students in turquoise much longer. And in contrast, all of the fact checkers figured out that this was a front group. Only 60% of the historians figured that out, and only 40% of the students did. And it took them, on average, much longer. And what was the thing that distinguished the fact checkers more than anything else? They understood something that seems a little bit counterintuitive, but that's that on the internet, in order to understand a source, you want to leave it. The fact checkers were very different than the students and the historians, who are smart people. This is not an effort to denigrate them. But they approached these unfamiliar sources with strategies that work well in a physical world. They read the sources carefully and read up and down on a single page. And when they did do searches, they often clicked randomly. And in contrast, the fact checkers read laterally. They almost immediately left an unfamiliar source and turned to the broader internet to figure out, what is this source? Is it what I think it is? Can I trust it? And in the process, they ignored a great deal of information. They didn't read the source carefully because they understood that we are living in an attention economy and that there are countless sources competing for attention. And what we need to determine is whether or not a source is worthy of our attention before we give our time and attention to it. And by turning to the broader web and figuring out what is this thing first, they were able to come to better conclusions about the credibility of particular sources. And so based on this research with professional fact checkers, we have set out to create curriculum materials. We're not trying to create an army of mini fact checkers. Instead, we want to distill down some of the approaches that the fact checkers used and teach them to students. And really, at the heart of what we're doing is a disposition towards information, to ask, who's behind this information? What is this thing? Do I know what I'm looking at? Is it a source of information that I want to use? And what's if I can't figure it out what it is, maybe I should just go somewhere else. And what we've done is go out to test these materials in a whole range of settings. In our most robust evaluation to date, we gave these materials to students across an entire urban school district, and we saw very clear growth after just 6 hours of instruction, less time than a typical teenager spends online in a single day. And there's a growing body of research to prove that this approach can work. There are now more than 14 studies with more than 10,000 participants, both by our research group and other research groups all across the world, showing that these are strategies that we can teach people, and that by doing so, we can lead to better outcomes, that people can become more discerning consumers of online information. And now going forward with schools, we think that it's critically important to identify ways to integrate this kind of instruction into classrooms. So if we're in a history classroom, what are the kind of Instagram posts or TikTok videos that we would like young people to investigate, to understand how the sources where we know they're spending their time also are implicated in core school subjects, and then give students opportunities to practice evaluating these sources in history class and in science class and in civics class, so that slowly but surely students begin to build the capacity to better reason about the types of sources that they are seeing all the time. We make our materials freely available on our website, which is cor.inquirygroup.org. The lesson plans are Google Docs. We also have Google Forms for the assessments and a whole bank of videos as well that are designed both for students to watch as well as educators. We created a whole video series with John Green and his team at Crash Course that are absolutely designed for the consumption by young people. And so with that, thank you so much for your time and attention. And Diana, I'd love to hear questions from the collection that have come in.
Well, thank you, Joel. Whenever I see your work, I'm reminded how important it is for kids to get these lessons. You guys do incredible work and have incredible lessons. But there's a question I'm going to ask the second part of it because it's a good one. Is there someone asking Congress or schools to mandate these kind of lessons?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So all across the country, there are efforts to enact legislation calling for media literacy instruction. And that looks really different in different places, but it's certainly we are seeing that shift. Organization called Media Literacy Now has a nice tracker of the kind of legislation that has been passed, and so there certainly is movement in that regard. I think that the key issue that we really need to attend to as this type of legislation comes online is what are the supports that are being created to help educators actually make this legislation a reality, because in many cases they are mandates without any support, and so teachers are being left to hold the bag. And further, we need to make sure that the kinds of resources that we are providing to teachers are ready to use and evidence-based. That the stakes are too high for us to be having untested resources be put into classrooms. And so there's a twofold need. One is to make sure that we are adequately supporting educators, both with curriculum materials that are ready to use and professional learning to assist them in using those materials. And then second, evidence-based for those resources, so that we're not going into this important realm blind about the efficacy of those materials.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned Media Literacy Now. I actually took their chart out of my presentation because there wasn't time. But if anyone wants to go to their website, they have an excellent map of the United States to show where the legislation stands in each state. So I really encourage people to go there. All right, so I think we're ready to open it up now. If I could welcome back all the presenters. We've got a whole bunch of questions to get through. So let's see, we've got a little time here to get that done. Gosh, I don't know who to start with this one. Here's a real good one. How do you deal with misinformation when there is a tiny kernel of truth in it? Example, there are a lot of pesticides in apples, part of plants known as the dirty dozen, but on the whole, they're healthy. How do you teach youth to look further? I think that this might be a question for you, Rakoen, since you pointed out this resource.
I knew the Apple was going to get back at me. Yeah, I was thinking about pesticides and GMOs and so on. You know, it can go a long way. Yeah, I mean, in many of the inoculation trainings we do, I mean, often as psychologists, we get accused of like, oh, you know, you're trying to spread a certain type of truth or inoculate people against certain viewpoints of life. But actually, much of the work we do is making people recognize these certain elements that might be manipulated, might be untrue partially, and not necessarily to then make them judge this is true or false, but rather this is a warning sign and do some extra research, right? So I think, I mean, nothing is 100% true or not 100% false. I think many things are, but many things of the information online has some mix of both, and that's the complexity of reality, and you cannot like put it down to just true or false. So yeah, I think any good training also has to incorporate this confidence level, right? And it's good to have some warning signs. And okay, apples are, if you know that apples are healthy and then someone tries to convince you otherwise, be open-minded, explore it, and then if you compare the evidence, then you'll probably see that it's not that bad at all.
Great advice. And we talked a little bit about deepfakes, but I don't think we talked about them enough because that's a huge thing that we're dealing with today, especially kids. And I was surprised when I was researching that to find out how many kids actually cannot discern if something is a deepfake. Uh, we include that in our curriculum. We give them little, checklist of things to look for. But who would like to address that here? Like, what would you tell maybe a teenager to look for to identify something as a deepfake?
I can certainly take that on. I would urge students not to focus on looking at the source carefully. I think that we are doing students a disservice if we give them a belief that they're going to identify most deepfakes. The technology is improving so quickly that that students could be led astray. Certainly, there are types of things that currently deepfakes generators are not as good at. But in general, like the best approach is to say, if I'm not sure if this thing is real, I should go somewhere else and try to get a sense of other information about it. If there is a deep fake claiming to show a politician doing something very outrageous, like I should go look elsewhere. Our eyes deceive us online, and the power of these tools is incredible. And so we don't want to give students a false sense of security that they're always going to be able to identify a problematic source. And so instead, better to think about, if I'm not sure about something, what are trusted sources that I could look to? And more broadly, if I'm not sure, I should probably just leave it, right? As a default, if I'm not sure about the provenance of a source, then I look elsewhere. And if I can't figure it out, I probably don't want to share that thing.
Okay, this is my question because we keep talking about trusted sources, but I'm finding that kids are starting to not trust anything. And so how do we help them understand what can be trusted? And I'm going to let whoever feels comfortable take this answer it because it's something that I'm grappling with myself.
I mean, I think one of the problems here is that we have created an information ecosystem in which truth and lies intermingle seamlessly. And so it is unsurprising that kids find it difficult to work out what is true or not and have no real sense of how they can work out what's true or not. And that's the reality, and it's not just for kids, right? So there's that state of being uncertain about how to work out what the truth is. It's called epistemic anxiety, and it's really correlated with conspiracist thinking as well. Because in the chaos of not knowing what's true or not, being told countervailing things and not really being able to discern between the two, you end up just looking for something which is solid and seemingly satisfying, a big answer, but actually isn't. And that leads to eventually to apathy. And apathy is a really, really, that's a dangerous, I always say the most dangerous thing for democracy is apathy. It's the tool of control used by the Soviet Union as much as it is by people who spread lies online so that you end up going for whatever conspiracy theory they're trying to promulgate. I'd make the point as well that, one of the issues that we have is that we have been telling people to look out for things like look for 3 hands or 6 fingers. And it's not a healthy thing to do, because what about when the AI generator doesn't generate 6 fingers? Then people think, well, that must be real then, because AI generates 6 fingers or 3 arms. And that's not good. We know some of the examples of how generative AI has been rubbish. But what we don't know is all the times when it's been convincing. You don't know the denominator. You don't know what that tiny, if that's a tiny proportion, that's sort of predictably bad generation. But you don't know how many times it's not made that mistake. And I think that's one of the problems that we're dealing with, is that we are dealing with utter chaos. I mean, you asked earlier on about truth, how a conspiracy theory may have an element of truth to it. Every conspiracy theory at its kernel has a lie. But truth can be used to mask the lie. And again, when we're talking about complex cognitive problems that adults have difficult discerning between, and I bet you any money I've got the least degrees of anyone on this panel. I'm actually a little bit embarrassed. I feel slightly humbled by the group I'm in. But I bet you any money, every single one of us believes something that's absolute nonsense. It is difficult to discern between them, and especially so for kids when they're going through a process of trying to understand the world around them, building the frameworks through which they interpret the world around them. And of course, we have now turned that into grey mush.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what I'm believing that may not be true here. So I'll have to give Potter that later on. So
If I can add something to that.
I believe no one can tell that I'm slightly losing my hair at the back. That's what I believe.
so
Can you just get into that, Diana?
yes, please.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the degrees and so on, right? So I think another mistake that sometimes people with all the credentials make is they say some statements that they have a lot of confidence for with a lot of confidence, but some other statements where they don't have a lot of evidence for, sometimes also a lot of confidence. And I think it's, if you build up a relationship with someone and you are often confident in your statements and you don't express any intellectual humility, but then are terribly wrong, you can damage your trust relationships, right? So there's also some interesting research on, like, okay, what do we do during COVID and so on? How did we communicate? And those channels who said, like, oh, the vaccine, there might be some problems with it, but it will be fine, versus channels that said, no, it's impossible to die from the vaccine, right? And then there were blood clots, right? And so it's interesting to take into account, how do you, even if you have expertise, how do you communicate that in a way that that you carry long-term trust and not just short-term, right? And I mean, that's more from a communicator standpoint. That doesn't help for the children necessarily to choose who to trust, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, just real quick, and I'll go to you, Joel. But I think we learn so much from just listening to the kids. What I mean, like, they're pretty smart about this stuff. And when you're talking about AI, that can get so wonky, but it's really simple to teach a child how AI works. And if they start understanding the mechanics of it, they're going to be a little more thoughtful, I think, on getting results from AI, or when they see something that's AI generated. So I don't know. Jill, go ahead. I
Just
interrupted.
to explain back, no, not at all. I apologize for interrupting you. Your point about what are trusted sources, I think, is a key part of all of this, is to make sure that students are seeing instances where they can find quality information. That there's a danger that instruction in this realm leads students to believe that nothing can be trusted, right? To Imran's point, right, and that they're in that is a terrible outcome, right? In the end, what we want is students to understand the incredible power that is at their fingertips, right? That they have the internet with this incredible resource of information, but how do we use it well? And so both making sure that we provide opportunities for students to see the powerful ways in which they can become better informed using online sources, and then also not to fall into this dichotomy of sources are real or fake, but rather so much of stuff is in the mucky middle, right? And to understand that source, really what I'm trying to think about is, what is this source, right? And what is the perspective of the source, and how might that perspective influence the content of the message that they're delivering? And so we often talk about having students think about the perspective and the authority, right? Like, what is the perspective of it, of a source? How might that influence what they're saying? And then also, like, what's the authority of this source to speak about a particular topic? Are they well suited to give me information that I could trust about this topic? And that those two things are not dichotomous, right? It's, they exist on a scale, and that we should think about them and reason about them in each instance.
I love it from perspective. That's so important. And yes, Andrew, I was going to go to you next, jump in, but I also wanted you to talk a little bit about developmentally appropriate ways to address all this with students. But it sounds like you had something else you wanted to put out there.
Yeah, just on the topic of the pessimism that's generated by the epistemic chaos that's out there. I think as a news consumer, it's natural to feel pessimistic, but there's also an educational opportunity here for teachers at all levels, K through 12, even college, to get people to think more deeply about knowledge, how knowledge is generated, how it's evaluated. There's these classic studies in cognitive and developmental psychology looking at people's understanding of knowledge. And the finding is that it takes graduate level education before you really understand what knowledge is, from sort of like the most sophisticated philosophical perspectives. Most people just have been absorbing things that have been given to them, which was okay in a time when there were 3 news channels and everything you saw on those channels was well vetted. But now that we live in this chaos, that work has shifted from the people producing news now onto the news consumer, and it's I guess we have to train people to think more deeply about knowledge at a younger age, but we don't have to also be totally pessimistic about it. It could be good to be thinking more deeply about what makes something a verified fact.
So can you talk a little bit about how you would introduce this at different developmental stages? I mean, obviously, this is really different for a 6-year-old than it is for a 17-year-old.
Sure. I mean, just thinking in terms of like the literature on epistemic understanding, there's there's some kinds of epistemic distinctions that are pretty easy to introduce even to young children, like the difference between a fact and an opinion, or the difference between a statement of fact and a statement of values. And those are things that, like, even in elementary school, children can, you know, grapple with, independent of, say, the internet. I think there's probably like a whole suite of instructional tips and techniques that need to be introduced when dealing with specific kinds of channels of media, the internet or social media platforms or whatever. But there's also potentially lessons in the production and evaluation of knowledge that could be implemented. I mean, typically that's not even addressed at all in K through 12 education.
Yeah. Okay. And I think this next question is perfect for you, Joel. How do you teach youth to learn from the news or fact check when so much is behind a paywall? Teaching them to search would either lead to dead ends, and the only results that will open are often from far right think tanks.
Yeah, it's a really important point. I also think this is a key part of having students reason about AI chatbots. Also, is to help students understand what is the information that AI models have been trained on, and that often things that are behind paywalls have not been included in those training sets. But yeah, I think that certainly part of what we want students to do is to think about what are the sources that may be more likely to yield accurate information, and it comes back to Andrew's point about how knowledge is produced, right? Is to think about what are the systems in place for the creation of that information. And sometimes, you are going to run into paywalls, and that's a real problem, right? And it's a question about how is journalism funded in the United States and more broadly. But I also think that we need to take a step back from the notion that students have to come to an exact understanding of what is going on, that, we don't need students to be fact checkers where they find every last detail. Instead, we want students to be able to figure out quickly, what is this thing? Is it something that I can trust? And in some cases, you don't need to read the entire paywalled article. The quick little blurb at the top will give you enough information, or you can find a well-sourced Wikipedia entry that gives you enough information to understand a source. And so part of this is we need to be reflective of the unbelievably overwhelming amount of information that is coming at all of us, right? And it's unrealistic to expect that students are going to spend a lot of time investigating any of these things. So what are the quick hit ways that we can get a better sense of the thing that's in front of us? That being said, that's not a total answer to the problem of information being behind paywalls. And more broadly, how do we ensure the continued access for all of us to better content? But in terms of how to think about it, part of it is to say, if you run into a paywall, what are other sources we could look for so we can figure out something quickly and not always have to rely on the incredibly long article, but rather even just the snippets in a search results page can often give us some clues about what is this thing that we're looking at.
As you're explaining this, I'm thinking how much kids actually love doing this, especially when they do it in groups, because it's almost investigative. They're trying to solve a problem together, and then they feel a sense of, hey, I did it. I found the right thing. So it's just a real fun thing to teach, as well as being so important. This next question is for you, Dr. Martens. You mentioned actively open-minded thinking is a skill, but I'm wondering if it's more of a personality trait, much like the big 5 personality trait of openness.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the jury is still undecided, but I think from what I've seen so far, it's a combination of all three of those things. It's a personality trait, it's a skill, but it's also for a big part a social norm in groups. So it's really, some groups are much more open to new perspectives, right? And others really force you to get streamlined in one viewpoint and don't allow any deviations. So then even if you're high in open-minded thinking, but you're in such a group, then it will be hard to express yourself. We did actually also did some research to compare, for example, the big 5 personality questionnaire, the openness factor on there, and it doesn't have a high correlation with the actively open-minded thinking. So it's actually slightly different. So the big 5 personality one is more about being open to new experiences and to science and literature and so on, while actively open-minded thinking is more really a way to process information, and intellectual humility is part of it, updating your opinion and really being able to really not just say that you're listening to another perspective, but really consider it. But yeah, it's still, the jury is still out how much the personality, social norm, or skill part of it has a role, and which one is easiest to teach or train or change in society, right? That's yeah, to be continued.
Great, thank you. And Imran, I've got one for you because you alluded to this a little bit in your presentation, and someone has asked, some people may recommend keeping kids off digital media, maybe forever. What's your take on that? I believe kids are being avoided, not raised, and left to the fake media. I don't know what that part means, but what's your thought about keeping kids off of digital media?
I mean, personally, I'm not an expert in this, and I only speak as someone who studies harms, and that gives me a really, cynical lens on the world. But I also know how powerful these technologies are. They can be a force multiplier for, the learning process. They can be incredible in engaging their imagination. I remember, I'm 46 years old. When I was 4 or 5 years old, my dad brought home a BBC Micro B computer with 32K of RAM. To anyone that knows these things, that's pretty cool, but very old and very slow. And I learned to program in BASIC, and that just sparked imagination like you wouldn't believe. I remember sitting there for hours trying to understand logic and programming. And that's a phenomenal gift to a child. So I don't want kids to be taken away from those. My job as someone who runs an advocacy organization is to make sure that platforms are safer, so that all of our kids can benefit from the enormous benefits of social media, this enormous library of information out there in the world, the power of artificial intelligence to be syncretic in bringing together information and synthesizing it into new forms and new ways of answering the questions that our kids have. What I want is safer AI, better social media, so that we can use it in the right way. But right now, we don't have that. And God willing, in a few years, I think there are jurisdictions around the world, like the EU and the UK, Canada, and others, which are working really hard to actually establish de minimis standards for these platforms and to ensure they're more transparent, accountable, and responsible on the way they're designed. So, watching brief, guys. Let's see what changes over the next few years. And I think that there is increased awareness and will to act from lawmakers around the world.
And what I would say to that question is good luck to those parents trying to keep their kids off. Kids need these tools. They need all of this for their futures. We need to educate them on how to be more discerning and how to use them well and safely. So any other last words on that? All right. Well, I think we've done it, Kris. If you want to come in, I think we've wrapped it up for you. Thank you so much to all the wonderful presenters. I learned a lot today. I'm going to for sure be watching the recording to get a lot of great resources. So thank you.
Thank you, Diana, and the entire panel for this thoughtful discussion on how children perceive and manage information they receive online and how adults can help them think critically and navigate digital challenges. If you found today's webinar insightful, help us keep the conversation going. Your donation ensures we can contribute and continue bringing you expert advice through our Ask the Experts webinars. It's easy to give. Just scan the QR code on your screen, Click the link in the chat or visit our website at childrenandscreens.org. Together, we can make a difference.